All right, let's go ahead and open up. Welcome to the fourth and final day of the Preschool Development Grant Annual Convening. We're so thrilled that you're here today and that you've joined us for this session. As typical, probably a few people will hop on, knowing that I'm going to give a little bit of housekeeping items and they won't miss much on the first minute or so of my part of the presentation. Today's session title is Leveraging Early Care and Education Governance to Affect Systems Change. And as I said, I've got just a few housekeeping items to remind everybody. First of all, you all know the drill. If you haven't done so already, please change your name on Zoom to share your first and last name and identify the state that you're from. This is really important, especially as we get to some of the more interactive parts and we hear from you. It's always nice to put the state name in context with your questions. If you have any concerns or problems about how to do that, please send a chat. Martha is our tech support for the day, and she's happy to help you with any tech needs that you have today. The next thing, if you happen to have called in with your phone in addition to video, please be sure to switch to phone audio so that we are able to link your name to the phone number. You'll see the instructions on how to do that on the screen. That also will help assign you to breakout rooms. And there's instructions on here how to do that. But again, send Martha or myself a chat if you need any assistance with that. Finally, during the presentation, we encourage you to present any questions or ideas you have in the chat box. One of us will be keeping an eye on those, and then later when there's opportunity, again, we're going to be using the chat box for your feedback. Please also mute yourself when you're not speaking so that we don't inadvertently get some audio that interferes with our speakers. All right. As I said, today's session is focused on leveraging early care and education government to affect systems change. It is my pleasure to introduce to you your speakers for today. Pull down so you can see everybody's faces. First of all, I'd like to introduce Adrienne Fisher, who is a policy analyst with the Education Commission of the States, where she is focused on issues related to early learning. Prior to joining ECS, Adrienne covered education policy issues with the National Conference of State Legislatures. Elliot Regenstein is a partner with Foresight Law and Policy. Elliot has extensive experience in state-level policy and advocacy, and is a frequent author and speaker on topics including accountability, governance, state data systems, and the connections between early learning and K-12. We're also pleased that we have two representatives from different states who are here to share their wisdom and expertise with us. And they happen to be two of my favorite states in the United States. Secretary Elizabeth Groginski serves as the first cabinet secretary for the newly created New Mexico Early Childhood Education and Care Department, a position for which she was appointed by Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham in November of 2019. Take note of that date. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit the nation just a few months later, Secretary Groginski led the department through a swift response to stabilize the childcare industry, secured long-term funding for early childhood programs and services, and implemented a historic expansion of the state's child care assistance program. You'll learn how this administrative structure supported that swift response. Next, Lachelle Brandt is the Senior Policy Advisor on Education to Governor Mark Gordon in Wyoming. I want to make sure I had his last name correct. She's a former classroom teacher and education consultant with the Wyoming Department of Education. With strong support from Governor Gordon, you'll hear from Lachelle the direction in which Wyoming is headed as they consider how early care and education programs are governed in that state. Thank you again very much for being here. We appreciate you, and we appreciate the time that our presenters are taking us. giving to us. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Adrian.
Thank you, Deborah. And hello, everyone. We're excited to have this opportunity to participate in this event and to spend time this morning highlighting some of the work states are doing around early care and education governance. As Deborah mentioned, my name is Adrienne Fisher. I'm a policy analyst with Education Commission of the States. Before we get into our agenda, I just want to touch briefly on who ECS is for those of you who might not be familiar. We're a national education policy organization that's been serving state policymakers for more than 60 years. We're nonpartisan and unbiased and cover the full spectrum of education issues from early learning through post-secondary and the workforce. We help states think through complex problems by utilizing our deep knowledge of research, best practices, and learning from other states to help policymakers make better informed decisions about what might work in their specific state context. And we do this in a variety of ways through research, report, convene, and counsel. We're often invited to talk with groups just like this one to share about what's trending across the states on national policy topics and offer ideas for states to consider. So for today's session, I'll begin by sharing some findings from one of our ECS reports on the national landscape of early care and education governance. Next, my colleague Elliot Regenstein will walk through a report he authored recently that aims to help states think through their existing governance landscape and make decisions about any changes that might be made. Then we'll hear from policymakers in Wyoming and New Mexico about recent developments in their states related to ECE governance. And after that, you'll have an opportunity to select a breakout room to hear more from our state experts and share and discuss your own experiences in state context. And we'll wrap up with any questions you might have for our presenters or state folks. Feel free to enter those into the chat at any time, and we'll answer as many as we can. So first, I'm going to take a few minutes to share some findings from our 50-state comparison of ECE governance, where we set out to determine what these governance systems look like across the states. To do that, we analyzed each state's governance structure and looked at agency oversight of early care and education components. So to make sense of how states structure their early learning governance, we identified three basic models that states fall under. The created model, so this means that the state has created a standalone lead agency specifically for early childhood with responsibility for multiple programs and functions. In a consolidated model, the state has consolidated multiple functions, including state pre-K and childcare, into a single agency that also has broader responsibilities. And finally, in the coordinated model, the state coordinates early childhood functions across two or more state agencies. I want to emphasize that there's a lot of nuance within these models, but these categories can help simplify things a little bit. And I also want to add a disclaimer that there's no such thing as a best governance structure. Every state has a different context. There are different constitutional requirements, agency authority, fiscal allocation constraints, you name it. And what that means is that what works well in one place might not work at all in another. And in a few minutes, Elliot's going to touch on how states can think through governance questions in a way that takes that state context into account. But first, let's take a look at how these governance models are distributed nationally. If we look at structures by state, the majority of states are operating under a coordinated governance structure, but some states have chosen to consolidate or create a new agency overseeing ECE components. This is still a developing area of policy, but it's one that more and more states are looking at strategically. I think it speaks volumes that this is the fourth session of this event addressing governance, and not to mention the fact that we've seen several state governance changes this year alone. Both Oregon and Colorado passed legislation this year to create a new state agency to oversee most of their ECE components. Colorado is currently developing their transition plan, which will be presented to the legislature next month, and the new agency will officially begin operations in July of 2022. Oregon's also developing their transition plan. It'll be presented and refined next year, with the agency going into effect January of 2023. North Dakota and Missouri took actions to consolidate their ECE governance this year. North Dakota did so through legislation, consolidating their components into a new early childhood division within the Department of Human Services. And in Missouri, Governor Michael Parson signed an executive order earlier this year to consolidate ECE programs into a new Office of Childhood within the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. And that office was officially launched last month. So we'll certainly be keeping track of these changes and following how those implementation processes roll out. Just to dig a little bit into some of the agency oversight across states, this graph shows the distribution of early care and education components by the agency overseeing them. And by components, we're referring to the 8 items on the left-hand side of the chart: Child Care Development Fund programs, quality rating and improvement systems, Individuals with Disabilities Act preschool special education, maternal, infant, and early childhood home visiting, Head Start and early Head Start, preschool development grants, state longitudinal data systems, and state-funded pre-K. These components are common to nearly all states and make up a significant portion of the birth through age 5 continuum. The agencies that oversee these components are listed in the key on the right side of the chart. And as you can see, many of the components are most frequently administered by the same type of agency across states. For example, you can see with the Child Care Development Fund programs, they're administered by human services agencies in 31 states. But other components are more varied in their agency oversight. Your preschool development grants, for example, have a pretty broad spectrum of oversight agencies. So as I mentioned before, this is a very complex area of early education policy, but looking at this landscape of structure and oversight gives us a good idea of where states are. So just a few takeaways I want to mention here. As I said before, there's no right way to structure ECE governance due to the unique needs of every state, but there are some best practices in developing the process that I think we can point to. This is a complex system, and the relationship between all these components is almost like a Rubik's Cube. Changing one thing can have a ripple effect in other parts of the system for providers and families, so making sure those considerations are thoroughly examined early in the process is critical. One thing we do hear from states that have undergone change is that taking the time for a gradual implementation process can be beneficial, allowing them to gather the right stakeholders and be very thoughtful and purposeful. And of course, anytime you're looking at the birth to 5 system, you have to take into account how those components can align with the K-12 system to create smoother transitions for children and families. I know a lot of that work is being done through PDG grants and strategic plans. And finally, in order to create the governance structure that works best for your state, it's so important to be asking the right questions throughout the process, which Elliot will get to in a moment. But before I hand it off, I did want to highlight a few relevant resources from ECS that might be of interest. These links are all live, and you should be able to access them from the PDF of this presentation and the resources. As always, feel free to reach out to ECS at any time for additional information or assistance on this or any other education topic. So I will next hand it off to Elliot Redenstein, who is a partner at Foresight Law and Policy, and he's going to walk us through some of the great resources he's developed on ECE governance. Elliot?
All right, thanks so much, Adrienne, and thanks so much to all of you for being here today. It's great to see so many of you with us. I want to start by saying a word about why this matters, right? Because there are a few things that we know relatively for sure. One is that the early years are incredibly important developmentally. Another is that adult-child interactions in those first 5 years really matter. Another is that program level characteristics of early care and education, we've seen that high quality programs can have a meaningful impact. And we've also got data showing that in the K-12 years, if children are behind, it's very hard to catch them up. All of you knew all of that coming in, so I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But what we really don't know, as Adrienne sort of alluded to, is what is the best way to organize state and local governments to deliver those high quality services at scale and connect early care and education in this larger network of early childhood services. And that's really what we're here to explore. I was fortunate to have a chance to write a report last year that I realize now I did not include a link in the PowerPoint, but I will just threw it in the chat. That was called Early Childhood Governance Getting There From Here, where I got to interview folks in more than half of the states and ask about their experience in early childhood governance. And from that, from those conversations, was able to distill a set of lessons that I will share with you today. I will note that one of my final interviews for the project was with Secretary Gruginski in Santa Fe on March 12th, 2020, right before everything shut down. So I was grateful to have had that opportunity. So some of the key issues, and I'm going to just sort of highlight these now and really go through them in depth in the coming minutes. First, setting priorities. What is it you're trying to accomplish through a governance change, potentially? Second, what is your process for talking about governance change? How are you going to make a decision about what your state's governance should look like? Next is defining critical functions. What is it? What is the work that's going to be accomplished by your revised governance structure? Comparative advantage is really important. What should be done at the state level, what should be done at the local level, and in many states, there's also regional components that are worth thinking about. What is your state's personnel capacity, right? Like, how many people do you have? What are they good at? How are you going to use them? That's a key part of this equation. And then the thing that is often the most politically charged is, how is that capacity going to be configured? Which agencies are going to have oversight of which programs? If you decide to do something different than what you're doing now, that instigates a change management process, and change management processes in government are not easy. So how are you preparing for that and getting ready to do that important work? And then finally, some sort of big picture considerations on whether or not it is worthwhile. I think, from having talked to states that have made major governance changes, they would all tell you that it was worthwhile. But that's not inevitably going to remain true forever. And it's worth pausing to think about, is it worth it before moving forward? And we'll talk a little bit about what that can entail. Okay, so that's the overview. Let's get into it. First of all, when it comes to setting clear priorities, the good news is, as PDG states, you've already done a lot of this work, right? A lot of the strategic planning that was done in year one of PDG grants really helped states identify what their top priorities are. This should not be different, right? If you're talking about governance, it's governance in service of executing the priorities that you identified in your strategic plan. And so there should be strong harmony between those visions. There is some value potentially in the conversation about governance and focusing on what are the top priorities, right? Your strategic plan probably covers more territory than a governance change would be able to. So again, like, how you structure that within the process, different states can vary, but that whatever it is, you should be really clear on, why are we changing governance? What is it we hope to accomplish? And there are a few different things that have been relatively common ideas among states. One is to try to minimize the burden on families, right? I mean, we all know how complicated the system is and how hard it is for families to navigate. One is to raise quality, right? The quality of services, and how can you make those better? Expanding access, right? Improving efficiency, right? That's something that gets talked about a lot, is how can government be more efficient? And then elevating leadership. This is something that I think you'll hear very much in Secretary Gerginski's comments, which is that in some states, they've felt like having a commissioner or near commissioner level leader to speak for the field is a real value, and adds a voice to political conversation that was not there previously. Any of those could be absolutely valid reasons. I'm not here to sort of make judgments among them, only to say that there are subtle differences between what you might get based on having different priorities. So it's important to be clear on what exactly is driving the conversation. I would note on the efficiency point that we all in the early childhood field have gotten used to a certain amount of inefficiency, and that when COVID-19 hit, the cost of that inefficiency was raised dramatically and driven home to all of us. And that for some number of states, I think they started looking at, wait a minute, like, we've been living with this suboptimal situation and maybe we shouldn't be. So whether you were thinking about this before or whether that's what inspired you to be here, that's all good. So once you've decided to go down this road, you need a process for having the conversation about governance. And that's something that should be inclusive, but also there should be clear leadership, and everyone should know who are advisors to the process and who's actually making the decisions. This is definitely not easy work. And Lachelle, I suspect, will speak to some of this, since I worked with her on this very process last year. There are a number of tensions that come into this. One is between insiders and outsiders, right? The folks in state government have one vision, and folks outside of state government may have a very different one. Another is inside, right? That, if there's a conversation about changing programs from one agency to another, even if those agencies both report up to the governor, which isn't always the case where you have separately elected, state superintendents, that those agencies may still disagree. And even if they're not doing it publicly, there may be real tension on the inside. Then there can be different visions within the same agency, right? There are times where agency leaders want one thing, and then the managers who actually are like running the program want something different. there's always the tension between change and the status quo. It is real easy for outside consultants like me to be like, oh, change is great. And for people whose day-to-day job it can be real easy to say, oh, like the status quo is working well enough, like let's not mess with it. And finding the right balance between those forces is a part of the process that's not always easy, but is critical. So whatever your process is, one thing that's key is to define some of the critical functions that you're trying to address as part of any governance change, because ultimately what is going to be, for government to be successful, it has to be serving some function. And there are a number of different functions that government serves. And again, all of these, whatever your governance structure is, will have to do all of it, but the emphasis might be in different places, depending on what it is you feel like you absolutely have to get right. A few things that come up across states as potential priorities here. One is money management, right? Government has an enormous role in distributing funding, doing its own budgeting, allocating resources, right? That is a key part of the complexity of the early childhood system, and definitely a motivator for states to talk about governance. Setting standards and maintaining quality, right? Like all of these programs have different requirements for what it is they're supposed to be doing and what it means for them to do it well. Who's overseeing that, right? How is that being managed? What data is being collected about it? And how is that data being used? Supporting professionals, right? We know that it's been an enormously difficult couple of years for the early childhood field, which was underpaid and overstretched coming into the pandemic. Who's helping them, right? How is this governance structure supporting those folks? Engaging families and stakeholders, right? One of the important aspects of governmental work is being responsive to the public and to the stakeholders who make up the system. How are you accounting for that in your governance structure? And then there's also a communications and public relations function, right? There are certain messages that the state can put out that it is very difficult for individual providers to put out, often relating to the importance of the first 5 years. But really, when you talk about communications, you're also talking about the bidirectional communication between state government and all these other stakeholders. So those are a lot of different pieces, and all of them are important to do in some ways, but the question of how do they fit together is something the state should wrestle with. The state also has to consider the impact of administrative burden, right? How is the state's regulatory regime impacting providers and impacting families? Yes, the state has to have regulations. Are all of those regulations worth it? Is the cost-benefit analysis favorable? How is the state thinking about that as part of any governance transition? And the idea that programs should be simple, accessible, respectful, right? How are you, again, you're weighing values here, but how are you thinking about the actual cost and who's bearing the burden of them? And that some of the costs include eligibility determinations, compliance, and just the psychological cost of having to go through these various processes for some of the families involved. So in sorting all that out, one thing to think about is who should do which jobs, right? We all know that there are things that state government does, not because it is best positioned to, but because they decided they were going to, and no one could tell them no. We also know that there are things that state governments don't do, even though they probably ought to, just because they're politically hard, right? That's just the nature of the beast. But if you're going to have a conversation about governance, it's worthwhile to think about what exactly is the state's job and where should it be, sort of giving more flexibility to communities and providers. So as you think about functions, think about which functions benefit from the ongoing direct input of parents and families, right? Because those are functions that are probably better off closer to the community level. There are other functions that may benefit from consistency and having sort of a stable backbone that everybody can take advantage of. Those may make more sense at the state level. Because how you configure things within state government is not the same as thinking about what authority state government has and what authority community level leaders have. And again, that's a key balancing point that should be part of the conversation. This has huge equity implications for those of you who think about those things, because in general, the communities that have the greatest need will have the most limited capacity. and that if the state is not performing certain functions for them, they may not be able to do them at all, right? So that thinking about how is the state accounting for that is key. I would also note that in some of these conversations, oversight of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and special education services is a key part of it, right? Part B services are generally expected to be in the state education agency. Part C services can be anywhere. But that because IDEA has so much federal oversight and creates an individual entitlement, it plays out a little bit differently than some of the other areas. Worth noting that that was something that came up in the interviews that I did. In thinking about the role of communities, valuable to think about local collaborative structures, right? And these are deeply valued in a lot of places. The state often has some role in structuring local early learning councils, or whatever they're called in different states. What is the right role of the state, and how is it setting these bodies up to be successful? What authority is it giving them? Is it defining roles for key participants? How is it doing that? You don't want to necessarily sometimes these things can turn into essentially sort of incumbency protection rackets, where whatever providers are strong when the body is created take it over and then run the system for their benefit. So that's something that states have to be on alert to and guard against. When you think about collaboration at the state level, this is something that a lot of states have struggled with. States are required by the Head Start Act to have a state advisory council. Those are in various levels of functionality. I'm on one, so I've been on one for 17 years now. So I have seen every level of functionality over those 17 years and appreciate the cycles this goes through in other states. How are those being used to engage multiple stakeholders, new stakeholders, and to hold people accountable while creating some amount of flexibility, right? It is hard for those groups to set an agenda, but it is possible, and there's some suggestions on doing that. Important also to think about, if you've got this state infrastructure and you're setting up local infrastructure, how are those two things remaining in a sort of constant conversation with each other in a rapidly evolving dynamic environment? So when you think about what's going on at the state, there's different kinds of personnel capacity, and there's inevitably tensions among these, right? There's the political leadership, the folks who run agencies and their immediate deputies. There are the managers who are overseeing the childcare program or the pre-K program or the special education programs. They have a very different perspective on the world and the work, and their action imperatives are going to be different than those of the political appointees they work with. And then you have to think about staff capacity. Do you even have the bodies to do the work, right? There are states where I talked to, and they had functions that should have had 10 people on them being done by 2 people, right? That's something that's important to think about as well. So common challenges in this work. One is, how do you get the governor and agency leaders and legislators involved? This is particularly a challenge in states where early childhood functions are spread across multiple agencies and are run almost solely by division managers. Those division managers are not able to create their own legislative or public relations plan, and the idea of early childhood can get buried in larger agencies' agendas. Again, the tension between political and managerial mandates is ever present. Division managers often don't have the support and capacity they need to be successful. Interagency collaboration is really hard, right? This is something a lot of states are struggling with. And if there isn't dedicated capacity for that, it becomes thing number 487 on everybody's list, and it doesn't happen effectively. So having adequate, and one of the things that a number of states pointed out is that having adequate staff can be really difficult, and that many states have personnel rules that make it hard for them to get the right people into the right jobs if they have enough jobs at all. So that's something that is a broader context in different states that's worth thinking about as well. This is a design challenge, right? And that all of us have to think about, how are we designing it? How are we designing state systems so they can be successful? Some states have set up public-private partnerships that create flexibility by allowing certain functions to be performed somewhat outside of state government. That can be really effective. It also sometimes creates other power centers, which can create incoherence. So again, there are both success stories and cautionary tales from that world, but it's definitely something worth thinking about. One thing that I think about a lot is, who in any of this infrastructure is really empowered to say the hard truths, right? That we know this work is desperately important, but we also know that it is not going to go perfectly at all times. Who is empowered to speak up about that and force a conversation about what needs to happen? One part of that, although not all of it, is what is the infrastructure for data and analytics? Who's even looking at what's going on out there? Do we know? And I would say in most states, the data infrastructure has a long way to go. Many states are working on that using PDG funds, which is super exciting. And I've been to a couple of the other sessions on that in this conference. But how are we making sense of what's going on out there and using that data to inform action? Okay, so configuring state capacity, you know you need to have it configured somehow. How are you going to do that? States think about a few different things in doing that. Are they thinking about birth to 5 or birth to 8? Are they thinking about early education and care? Or are they thinking about comprehensive early development, which would include a whole other range of health and human service, functions? Are they thinking about creating elevated leadership? How important is that? In different states, some states, small agencies can be successful, others less so. Some states really need leadership on early childhood, others already have it. How does that factor into the calculus? Can the state decentralize certain functions, right? Is it a state where state agencies often regionalize their oversight? These are all things to take into account when thinking about what is the best configuration of state capacity. Again, recognizing, Adrian showed you, there's a lot of different combinations and there's no magical single best answer. You can see that, and I'll be very brief on this slide because Adrienne already showed you the full map that ECS did, but that there are a lot of different ways to think about it. States have made different choices based on their local context. And I would not want to say that any of them were wrong, right? That they all had good reasons for doing what they did and that they just came out in different places. There are some considerations in thinking about host agencies if you are consolidating into an education or human services agencies. Speaking broadly, the perception is that state education agencies will be better at supporting educational functions in a state preschool, but are less adept at dealing with the whole range of private providers, right? Like their world is set up for school districts and that's who's most familiar to them. The overall narrative about human services agencies tends to be just the flip side, right? Like that they're much better at dealing with the range of private providers, but not as strong as providing that educational backbone. Those are generalities and that they represent varying degrees of truth in different states, but I would only note those because as you go into those conversations, those narratives are likely to emerge. However you configure your capacity, you're going to need to have some interagency connective tissue, a state advisory council, other bodies. The question of how effective those are, right, often depends on how much people see them as mattering and how involved the governor's office is in them. Where is the leadership coming from? Do people really feel like there's an agenda being driven? And is it worthwhile, right? And different advisory groups serve different functions. Some of them bring together people from the inside and the outside. Some are just insiders, and those serve different purposes, and you may well want to have both. All right, change management. We're getting close to the end. I know I've been talking a lot and talking fast. It's hard for any organization, particularly in government where you're dealing with all kinds of vending and procurement requirements that can make it really hard to get the support you need. Federal grants are an opportunity to get some support for that, so it's a good opportunity to think about that. There are a lot of different challenges you have to address. There are practical challenges, right? You're bringing together two divisions that are on different IT systems, that are on different payroll, right? Like it's all like that little stuff matters. Then also cultural challenges, right? Every agency has their own culture, and that when you bring together divisions of different agencies, those cultures don't mesh automatically. There needs strong leadership that works on that. I definitely heard a couple of states that have made governance changes talk about, quote, bringing the silos closer together as opposed to actually breaking them down. Again, that takes leadership and focus to do that. So it's also important to think about this as a step in an evolution, right? No one has really solved this, and that if we're all doing the exact same thing 20 years from now that we're doing today, maybe that means we haven't learned, right? So how are you setting yourself up to learn over time, adjust on the fly, especially if you make a seismic change? You're going to learn a lot in the few years after that. And for stability's sake, you don't want to be changing constantly, but you also don't want to, have whatever structure you create feel frozen in amber so that you can never come back to it. So some key considerations, is it worth it, right? Again, think about in your state, do you have high-level leadership? Are you looking for it? Would this governance change create it? No structure solves all the problems. And there are definitely states that have like moved programs thinking that would fix the programs and it didn't. So are you really setting yourself up to make change and have programs be better? Are you defining roles effectively, right? Like everybody's got a role to play, different agencies, the state and local government. How well are those roles being defined? Political symbolism does matter, right? Like that some of the states that have created agencies, it was really important to the early childhood communities in those states to be seen as having the dignity of a standalone agency. In some states, the early childhood folks like being part of an education or human services agency because of the branding that gives, right? That isn't necessarily the only driver, but it is a real driver. The idea that the status quo has a cost, right? Like we are making it hard for families every day, and that is not costless. And so when you think about the costs of change, how do those compare to the costs of the status quo? And I would add that it's interesting in these conversations how many folks focus on the administrative costs of a change, right? Like the handful of FTE differences in FTE counts in state agencies, as opposed to what does this mean for the tens and hundreds of millions of dollars that we're spending to serve children and families. That's natural and I totally get it, but the more the conversation is about FTEs in the state agency and the less it is about the impact on children and families, the less well this is likely to go overall. Perfection should not be the enemy of improvement, right? Just sort of building on what I just said, like you're not going to get everything right the first time. How are you getting as much right as you can and leaving yourself room to grow and evolve as you learn more, which is basically why it's important to think of the process as being dynamic over time. We should be constantly learning, growing, and changing, and that any change in governance should just represent a chapter move, not sort of the end of the book. All right, I'm a couple minutes over. I want to keep us on track. So thank you for listening to all of that. We will have time for question and answer for both me and Adrian and our two state guest speakers coming up after they present. But right now, I want you to hear from two leaders in states who have both been wrestling with governance and are at very different points in their evolution. So first, it's my great privilege to introduce Lachelle Brandt from the Wyoming Governor's Office to talk about the work they've been doing to try to make changes in governance. Lachelle, please take it away.
Thank you, Elliot. It's a real pleasure to participate in this session today and have the opportunity to share experience and efforts from Wyoming over the last few years. I just want to say working with Elliot has been incredibly beneficial in this process. It has not been easy work for us, as he pointed out, amidst the pandemic. And he's been very instrumental in the progress and success we have experienced this far. I will say politically, early childhood governance has been a very sensitive topic in Wyoming. Wyoming has a very strong focus on local control. And so there's been a little appetite to really take a run at making changes due to the heavy lift, as well as confronting some of the adversity that perhaps we knew would occur here in Wyoming. So I guess the first question to ask is, why did the governor's office decide to start down this road in the first place? And what I would say the answer to that is in September of 2019, at the beginning of his administration, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services released the funding grant for the preschool development birth through 5. And Wyoming at that time was included as one of the top states, 10 states and territories that were eligible for the grant. And around that same time frame, in December of 2018, the Bipartisan Policy Center conducted a state-by-state analysis that you might be familiar about, the efficiency of early childhood governance systems. And Wyoming was ranked 49th in the US in the report. And it suggested in the report that governors conduct a review and analysis of the system. So to us, the results of that report were not surprising, as Wyoming at the time was very fragmented and lacked a vision and strategic plan for our early childhood care and education. The state had spent over a decade analyzing early childhood efficacy and governance without little to no change. There were 4 state agencies overseeing the birth through 5 services, as well as 2 additional federal programs, home visiting, McVie and Head Start, were administered by parents as teachers and local grantees. Additionally, we were hearing from many leaders in our system that were frustrated by their experiences of this fragmented system. And so as a result, Governor Gordon started working with a nonprofit in Wyoming to form an application team to develop and submit the application for the initial grant. And in December of 2019, Wyoming was awarded approximately $2 million for the grant. And so we do have an early childhood advisory council that it was established through an executive order. And so that group began working very closely with a grant manager to work on the grant activities in the 5 key required areas, which included the needs assessment, the strategic plan, the maximizing of parental knowledge and choice, the sharing of best practices among early childhood care and education, and then lastly, improving the overall program quality. So after we received the grant, we started putting together a cross sector group for the governance task force that was one component of the strategic plan work group. And that had stakeholders from across the state who met 7 times over the course of the year. And Elliot was instrumental in leading us and leading that group. The initial work that we did was to identify some common shared goals and values. And those were very similar to what Elliot pointed out earlier in his remarks. The key principles that they agreed on from our task force was that Wyoming needed a more coherent system. It needed that high level of leadership that Elliot spoke to earlier, greater policy clarity, better information for parents, and then an infrastructure to deliver quality and increase access. They also highlighted core functions necessary, including money management, encouraging and supporting families, supporting professionals, and then communicating about early childhood development. So after we identified the key principles and priorities, we discussed different approaches to state agency governance that you also heard earlier: a coordinated system, a consolidated system, or the creation of a new system. Under our current budget restraints, there wasn't really a political appetite for a new agency at the time, with the concern that it would cost additional funds. And so the task force really recommended consolidation at the time, and moving as much as we could into one location, recognizing that they believe that IDA programs fit best in our Department of Education, and then home visiting and childcare belonged in our Department of Family Services. So the task force, while they didn't recommend one single agency like we might have hoped for, it did perhaps suggest that we could consolidate down from 4 to 2 agencies. And so based on all of their recommendations, the governor's office worked with the legislature on a draft bill on the task force recommendations. And it prompted a lot of great discussions, and we made some great headway, but it ended up dying in committee. And there were several reasons that the bill died. And I think those particularly were that the task force was kind of high level, and we hadn't had the time yet to fill in the gaps about that are important, as Elliot pointed out, as well as how the implementation would occur after those programs were moved. We didn't have a lot of time to educate the public or the legislature really before the committee. And then some of the opponents of the bill really raised concerns and used the blank spaces that were in the bill, perhaps for filling in sometimes some inaccuracies, but left question marks regardless. So where we are currently in our next steps in Wyoming is this really paved the way, this initial grant, for us to apply for the extension grant, the continuation grant. And so we did apply for that, and we were awarded that in 2021. And so, you know, we've been working with Elliott now on a essentially transition report on how we would implement these recommendations provided by the task force, to fill in those blanks that we're missing in the conversations. At the state level, we also have made some of the changes that the task force recommended because they didn't require statutory changes. So we essentially have consolidated down from 4 to 3 currently agencies at the moment. And we're continuing, recognizing that our challenges haven't gone away. As Elliott suggested, you know, he's taught me some patience, that this doesn't perhaps occur just in 1 year, that it perhaps takes multiple years before we get to the finish line where we're hoping to be. But I will say I'm very proud of the work that Wyoming has accomplished with the initial grant. It's the first time that we've really had a robust needs assessment and developed a strategic plan. And I believe that in this next grant, we'll also just continue to build upon those recommendations by the task force and getting us to the important implementation for these programs to run more smoothly, and so that they're more coordinated, not just at the state level, but also at the local level. So with that, Elliott, I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. And I should say that the next step in the Wyoming process is the release of the transition report that I've been working on this year, which is coming out Monday. It was not intentional that I was waiting until right after this session, but hopefully we're all still going to be getting along after that happens. If anyone's interested in that, it'll be a public domain document, and I can certainly send it to you. If you are having trouble sleeping, it may well help you because it's quite long and involves a lot of interviews with a lot of Wyoming stakeholders. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Elizabeth Graginski, who is the first secretary of New Mexico's new standalone early childhood education and care agency. Elizabeth, please talk to us about the experience you've had in New Mexico.
Great. Thanks, Elliott. And thanks, Adrian, for your setup for this conversation. And Lachelle, it's great to hear your story. I am fortunate to have been able to come to New Mexico after lots of incredible people had done work over about a decade to bring this bill forward in March of 2019, the Early Childhood Education and Care Act. I'm going to share a couple things that I think highlight from Elliott's remarks that I think will show why New Mexico was so successful. It was really there was a strong public-private partnership that led to putting this bill forward and making sure that it got across the finish line. Those were business leaders, those were philanthropy, those were advocates working closely with the governor's office and with legislators to create the bill. That again, the first time the bill was introduced, not this bill, but the bill to create a department, was about 10 years prior to 2019. So in the interim, we were a early learning race to the top state. Also then the PDG grant came. So I think those were the conditions that were fostering the work, and having the 3 departments that were then programs from these 3 departments: Public Education Department, Children, Youth and Families Department, and the Department of Health, that were brought under this umbrella, this new department. Other really important things that were part of the bill that created the department and the leadership of Governor Lujan Grisham is that there was going to be an advisory group that was going to be representative of key stakeholders across the state, representing, and just to give you all a sense of what's in this department, it is home visiting, early intervention, childcare, pre-K, child and adult care food program, summer food service program, which is part of that. And then a New Mexico program called Families First, which is a perinatal case management program. And with everything comes all the quality supports, everything that for all those programs and services, the quality. So within that, we said we need to talk with people from across the state. New Mexico is a very large geographic state, but small population. Not quite as small as Wyoming, but we're 2 million across our state. And so that was a really important part. And they were to inform us on both wage and career compensation for the early childhood workforce, and also our performance measures and how we should be looking at our data. The other thing that was part of the bill that created our department was an assistant secretary for Native American early education and care. We have 23 sovereign nations here in New Mexico within our boundaries, and we knew that it was going to be very important to ensure strong government to government relationships, that again, to Elliot's point about leadership, that we had a high placed position within the department to focus on our relationships with our tribal governments. And then the other really great thing was a 4-year finance plan. Similar to Elliot's new release, ours will be released next month, our first of our attempt at a 4-year finance plan. And I know this is about governance, but I think we have to talk about governance and financing together, as you saw in Elliot's remarks. Where does the money come? How's the money going to support that? And so again, to this success in New Mexico was Governor Lujan Grisham saying in her second year, we need to find a way to make sure this new department has a ongoing source of funding, which is when we created the Early Childhood Trust Fund. And then next year for the voters to decide if the Land Grant Permanent Fund, a portion of that will fund this department. So right from the get-go, there was a lot of thinking about high-level leadership to ensure the most vulnerable children and families in our state were getting the supports they needed, and then how are we going to continue to finance this? Equity has always been a core tenet of our work. It was built into our needs assessment, into our statewide strategic plan. And for us, that means we're really centering our work around those most impacted. And when we do that, we know that our system that we design is going to actually reach the families and all families and children in New Mexico with the quality programs and services they need and deserve. So we knew that to do this, we were going to have to really get strategic. And so in addition to our strategic plan and this advisory council, I worked with the Hunt Institute and set up a transition committee. This may be something other states have done. It was made up of cabinet secretaries, legislators, and business leaders, and us a few national experts in early childhood. And we met, this was all during the pandemic. We launched July 1st, 2020, our new department. And so we started meeting virtually, but it was really important that we had those stakeholders at the table to shape how the new department would focus over its next 3 to 5 years. And so out of that transition committee, we came up with 5 strategic priorities, which were to grow investments. We knew we would never achieve, for New Mexico, we're 49th in child well-being, we're 50th in child poverty, we're 50th in child hunger. So we have these staggering statistics that kind of confront us, which was a lot of the impetus, I think, behind bipartisan support for this new department, bipartisan support for the Early Childhood Trust Fund, because we knew that we had to really come together in a significant way and make a shift. Like, we're not going to incrementally change those numbers. We have to make a transformational shift. So this transition committee, grow investments, advance a diverse and well-compensated workforce. That has to come next in order for us to increase access and quality. And in order for us to achieve equity, we have to bring more voices to the table. We have to center our work again around those most impacted, and we have to enhance authentic collaboration. We do not have a local structure in New Mexico. In our public health offices, they're state, but they have public health offices. But we knew that we needed to harness more of the knowledge and the expertise in the base of communities all over the state. When the pandemic first started, I started daily calls. We just opened up a Zoom link, and every day for 5 weeks, 8 to 9, anybody who wanted to join could join because the information was changing so rapidly. That really gave us a chance as a new department to build strong relationships in a virtual world. And we plan to continue that. We now do every other week, 8 to 9 Tuesday mornings, but it has been a wonderful way to keep the two-way communication and to learn from communities about what's needed. So the transition committee was very effective. We have that transition committee report on our website. You can look at it. We have strategies around it. It dovetailed very nicely with our PDG strategic plan. And around the equity piece, and I think to speak to Elliot's issues about culture and bringing departments together, from the get-go, we took a very intentional approach around professional development, around change management, around equity and how are we going to support both the executive leadership team of the new department and then the next line of leadership in being able to implement this monumental shift that had just happened in the state. So we invested in that. We invested in facilitation and coaches, and we worked with the whole staff in the agency to develop our core values, to develop our agency strategic plan. What were we going to do in our first 18 months that was mission critical for us to be successful? And part of that was to say, we want all of our staff to understand what we mean by equity. So we mandated an embracing equity training for all the staff, but we also did a peer-to-peer coaching among leadership team and doing a lot of development. That work continues. We've invested in another year of that intentional professional development for our executive leadership and our next line of leadership, and making sure that our staff are coming along with us on this journey. We really always emphasize that our commitment is to create a cohesive, equitable, and effective prenatal to 5 early childhood system. So we always bring it back to that, like, what is that going to take? What is that going to take from us as individuals in our seat that we live every day, our day to day, and as teams and as a larger department and in partnership with our community. So these are some of the things that we've done around making sure that this new department is operating at its best and its most optimal. And again, lots of work to continue to do that. We're actually having our first in-person hybrid meeting tomorrow down in Socorro, New Mexico. So we have not seen each other in person since this new department has been created, just on Zoom. So that's an exciting thing. Some of the things that we've learned, communication. You have so many different stakeholders. I think Elliot shared that in his, is some people still don't even know that we do licensing, that we do childcare. They still think it's the Children, Youth, and Families Department. So I can't overemphasize that enough in terms of building that into your planning, how you're communicating, what are the vehicles by which we communicate, and again, to the data system. We have programs that came from Department of Health. We have our programs, they all do ages and stages, but they're all in different systems. So ages and stages, developmental questionnaire for children. And so we're thinking, how do we get this data together? So that continues to be something that we're challenged by, but we're very excited. I actually have our director, Dr. Tiffany Wynn of our Policy Research and Quality Initiatives here she's new on the job to hear and learn what does this mean, early childhood governance, and really brings a huge expertise. And I think that goes to the point of who do you bring into these leadership roles? Expertise in quantitative data, policy development, and how those things connect very deeply. I think the other things that we have been able to do is partner with, just again, the private sector, really strong relationships with our funder community, really strong relationships with the business community. And so I think as I ponder, and again, the Early Childhood Trust Fund being there has been so beneficial to us, because that's where legislators and governors will get nervous as you start setting up a new department, because we know that who we're serving right now, we're not at scale. And how we're serving them is not at the level of quality we need. So, and the promise of new departments or new consolidations is that things are going to get better. So to manage those expectations and to really understand, we have to be thoughtful about that and know that there has to be additional revenues that are going to come in order for this new governance initiative to make a difference in the lives of families and children and the people who care for them and serve them. So just to not think that the system itself already has enough resources, because it doesn't. And by putting them together, the efficiencies that you may achieve, you probably won't achieve them right away, but in the long term, the promise of the early childhood, these critical years of development, is when we do it well, and we have enough resources and finances to support them, to support at scale and the level of quality that we know is necessary in order for those outcomes to happen, then these governance structures will make a difference. So just the financing piece has to be part of your conversation along with the governance, because we don't want legislators or governors to think that a structure itself without additional resources will change the trajectory for whole populations of children or allow us as state government to really meet the needs of all families and children. I think that's enough. I might have taken too long, but those are some of the lessons learned. Looking forward to hearing your questions and talking more in breakout as well.
Great. So we actually, I think we're running a little behind what our initial schedule was, which is totally fine. And it's also not an enormous group. So I think we may actually not go into breakouts, but would encourage folks to have, share questions with the whole group. If people want to put questions in the chat, I'm happy to read them out. If people want to use the hand raising function, which I have to be honest, I'm not 100% sure how to do. Oh yeah, it's under reactions. You can go to raise hand. I love working on data systems, but actually using technology is not always my strength. So if people want to raise their hands, I'd be happy to call on them for questions. And the first one I see is Matt Keene from Minnesota. So Matt, jump on in, please.
Yeah, thanks. Both of you from Wyoming and New Mexico have touched on this, but I want to just kind of call it out and see if I can get you to identify a couple of key areas. It isn't easy. It isn't easy to as you've indicated, to grab the bull by the horns and make a change in governance. So what needs to happen, or what needs to be true for a state to succeed with that effort? And in the case of Wyoming, I think your experience with starting down that pike and not quite getting to where you thought you would, in the case of New Mexico making a change. I'd love to hear if there's one or two things that you said, boy, this is what really needs to be true or needs to happen.
I'll go first, I guess. From my experience, this last year, I think I suggested earlier that I think communicating early with policymakers and keeping them apprised of the work that was occurring was one of the comments and pushback we received, is that they weren't informed early enough in the process. So they weren't ready to take our recommendation without kind of further details behind what we were asking as far as the changes as well. So those are the pieces that we're trying to add in currently, is here's the broad recommendation for the move, but this is how it would be implemented. This is how the implementation would improve by these changes. So I think communicating early and keeping them apprised of the process was probably one thing that would have really benefited us. And this work Elliot's done following that is also, I think, important, is communicating with all stakeholders. I mean, we did the needs assessment, but again, just talking about, okay, here's the recommendations. What are your thoughts on these transitions? What are the pros? What are the cons? Some of those conversations we didn't have, honestly. And this wasn't a new topic, so we were hoping that with some of the previous discussions that had occurred over the past decade, that would help the argument, but that still wasn't enough to move it across the finish line.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this is going to answer your question, but I think really being clear on the purpose of your effort and having those stakeholders engaged. So for New Mexico, it was very much this, we are not doing well for families and children in the state. And we've also, the lieutenant governor who ran the first, he's now lieutenant governor. When he was in the Senate, he ran the first bill. And he remembers the year the state lapsed like 20 million of federal dollars in childcare, and it wasn't like a blame thing, but it was these programs are embedded in all these other agencies where the eyes on these critical programs for families and children are not at the level we need. And so there was a real case, a strong business case to be made for bringing it together, and then having, like I said, the business leaders, philanthropy, and advocates very well aligned with legislators. And the lieutenant governor will tell the story about, they didn't really know as Governor Lujan Grisham was coming in, and it was just right before she was about to get up and make her first speech about the state. And her advisor told him she's going to put this on her call, like this is going to be her main thing to get this department. And that really gave him a lot of excitement and a lot of momentum. So you do need that leadership at that very high level. Could come from the legislature, but I mean, honestly, the governor's office is going to be critical when you talk about executive agencies changing. We also, our governor made every cabinet secretary who was impacted they wanted to be there too, but it was essential that they were at every committee hearing, all saying this is what the state needs to do. And I think that was a huge impetus, because that's where you could get divisive and say, well, we don't think this is good. So those were some things I think that have to be true in order for you to really make these changes. And then again, the financing, I won't, make sure you're thinking through the long path forward.
I would agree with the secretary as far as agency. That was another piece for Wyoming, is this was affecting 4 different agencies. And so ensuring that all of those individuals were on board so that they were supportive in the discussions happening is a key piece as well.
And one thing that we,
great question and some.
Yeah,
sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, keeping your federal partners in mind too as you're planning. We did do that. If we could go back and do it over, probably would have had a much more intentional strategy around all that work. It took us quite a long time to get, McBee and other things, because state fiscal years are often different than federal fiscal year. So not to minimize the impact and the partnership with your federal partners that needs to be part of the planning as well.
I want to give a little kudos here, and not to sort of open the floodgates for you, Secretary, but that last year I was on a commission in Illinois that was making recommendations on governance and finance changes, and that we had some outreach to the New Mexico staff who had lived through some of the changes, and they were incredibly helpful in talking about what went well, what didn't go well in some of the transition. And that some of that was really valuable. And I say that in part because our next questioner is one of my Illinois colleagues, Maggie Collar. So Maggie, take it away.
Thank you so much, Elliot, and thanks everyone. This is just really fascinating. I think governance work is just amazing. So just one thing I'm kind of curious about, and piggybacking on what was just stated about federal programs, how does Head Start fit into this mix of consolidating or coordinating and data systems and alignment, and whether, I don't know, Elliot, if you have any recommendations or if anyone else has any examples of what they've done to kind of integrate Head Start?
So that's a great question, and maybe I'll take a first stab at it, and then would love to hear from Lachelle and Elizabeth. So, as all of you know, Head Start is funded directly federal to local, and that how that fits in state constructs does vary. There's a Head Start collaboration office that is the state government's role in that, and that generally states that are consolidating try to include that in whatever they're consolidating, or if they're creating an agency, to include it with that. And I think it's also really important to think about Head Start as a key stakeholder in the process of setting something up. So for example, in Wyoming, the governor's task force, the governance task force had a representative from the Head Start community, and that when that representative spoke about what the community wanted, that was clearly meaningful to the rest of the task force. And in fact, what the Head Start community in Wyoming wanted, again, not sure that this will be true everywhere, was they really wanted to be where IDEA was. And so when the task force made its recommendations that IDEA should be consolidated in the education agency, that the Head Start collab office was also put there by the task force in deference to that community's wishes. So again, the substantive result will vary from place to place, but the fact that the Head Start community was involved in the process and that its needs were reflected in the conversation, I think is really important. And when you think about the legislative process you want to go through, you do not want to have leaders from Head Start coming to the legislature and saying, hey, like all this stuff you're talking about, like, why did no one talk to us? We're a part of this too. What you want them doing is saying, hey, like we were a part of this and we're comfortable with what's happening, right? So that was, that's one of the things that I think a number of states have really been good about, and would certainly urge others to think about in the future. Michelle, I don't know if you have anything you want to add about the Wyoming process, and then would love to turn it to you, Secretary, to talk about New Mexico.
I think you did a great job in describing what occurred here. We did actually, even though that bill died for those changes, we did move forward in working with those two agencies in the governor's office through our budget process to move the Head Start Collaborative Office from our Workforce Services Department into the Department of Education. So that was one of the changes that we were able to move forward with from the recommendations.
Yeah, and I would thank you for that question, Maggie. So important. I think when our administration took over, there was a lot of concern among the legislators about how New Mexico pre-K was kind of pushing out Head Start, and we were kind of not maximizing all the federal dollars we could. And so that Mariana Padilla, the Children's Cabinet Director, was, by the time I got here in November, they had already been having regular meetings with the Head Start grantees, both our tribal and non-tribal early Head Start, but really the Head Start, because there was a lot of concern in the legislature that this was not good. And there was concern in the Head Start community that programs were being started without an eye to, we're here and you're funding a school and now we're competing. And so we elevated the Head Start Collab Director to the office of the Secretary. That was an intentional move. I was a Head Start Collab Director, so of course I had strong feelings about that. And I thought that it was important from a policy standpoint, because everything a Collab Director is supposed to do is really about breaking down barriers for low-income families to accessing all the services. So that's been helpful. We meet regularly with the Head Start Association. We brought them together with the Public Education Secretary and his leadership team to talk about IDA issues and also transition and the whole coordination requirement that is part of the Every Student Succeeds Act now, to making sure that Head Start programs are part of that. We make sure Head Start programs know about all of our New Mexico pre-K funding opportunities, and we have massive spreadsheets, hoping soon with Dr. Wynn on board, we could make it into something more manageable to share with the community, but to show how many children we have in each of these communities, how many Head Start slots we have, how many public school. So when we made our funding decisions, we had that information in front of us, and we were able to say, we can't really fund you because there's already saturation in that community. So you need to work together. And then the next thing we've done is we funded local early childhood system building grants with our CURSA money, and with a key priority there being bringing public school, Head Start, and the private sector together at the local level to talk together and work more collaboratively around enrollment.
Great. Thank you. Again, terrific question and some great answers. I have a question, but I would love it if somebody else does. So anyone else want to jump in? So one of the things that Secretary Gerginski's answer just touched on is working with education. And one way or another, the children, whatever the scope of an early childhood governance change, the kids from early childhood are going to go into the public school system. So the role of public schools and the relationship between the state education agency and the early childhood agency are really critical. So, in Wyoming, I know the state superintendent is actually elected separately from the governor, but that the Department of Education and the administration worked together over the course of the task force and subsequently as well. So Michelle, in a minute, I'd love to have you say a word about that. And then Secretary, if you can talk a little bit about what it's like to work with the education agency once there is an early childhood agency, right? Like that's a relationship that many states have never experienced before. And so to think about that dynamic is an important consideration, and would love to hear your comments on that. But Michelle, maybe if we could start with you.
You threw me a tough one. This has probably been our biggest challenge over in in this in these changes. And what I will say is that Wyoming has an elected state superintendent, which we have a great working relationship with. But the way that the Part C and B has been structured is that, the Department of Education has oversight of the programs, but our legislature has put those programs into our Department of Health, under our Behavioral Health Division. And it's been that way for years. And so the concern, I think, for our child development centers was that they will be in direct competition with our school districts if it were to move under the Department of Education, which was the recommendation from our task force. That created, they have a lot of local support, our child development centers do, and that created that relationship that the secretary talked about with business and industry. They have a lot of support in some of their communities. So the political outfall from that recommendation, I think there was concerns about, some of the accountability, really, honestly, that will occur probably from the experts of IDEA directly having oversight of those programs, if I were to be quite frank, because currently we're faced with a lot of corrective action plans, things that need to change. But the concern is that really could occur, but will that take away from our program? Will that take funding away? Will we lose our program? All of those kind of concerns, I think, are legitimate, but that became more of the conversation than just talking about the overall change of the entire structure. How can we make our entire system better? It really became kind of this political thing about moving those programs specifically. And so that was sort of unfortunate. But I will say that relationship between early childhood and the Department of Education definitely had an impact, as Elliot said. So we're still working through some of that to try to really identify what are the concerns and how can we partner rather than it be a direct, I guess, competition or taking away from any of those efforts that are occurring in their local communities.
Yeah, thank you. In New Mexico, again, we were fortunate because the governor had a cradle to career education plan. So I am one of 3 education secretaries, and we also have workforce solutions with us. So we have our education huddle. We had a big town hall the first month I was here with all 3 of the education secretaries up there taking calls, taking questions from the audience with the governor. So we see ourselves as all education. And you're right, Elliot, it is a really good feeling because the ability to talk with those colleagues about workforce issues, about transition issues, and know that this is an equity issue. We did get our department, so the education secretary also reports to the governor and appointed. We met with the Office of Special Education Programs at the U.S. Department of Education because it's clear in the law that created our department that we're responsible for preschool in every setting, mixed delivery, we've got PDG here, the mixed delivery system, and that all children and families, it needs to look similar. Families need to be able to have access to New Mexico pre-K that isn't, oh, it's over here, so it looks different. Here it looks different. So we plan to do through an MOU to detail the Part C 619 coordinator to our department, remain a PED in a public education department employee, but bring them in because the guidance, the support for family, the support for educators, it has to be through all the settings. So I think sometimes when it's just in the Department of Ed, their orientation will be to schools, but we have all these children who have special needs that are in our community-based settings, in our family childcare homes that are offering pre-K, and those children are having to get those services by going to the school. So we want to see that again, trust fund, financing coming, hopefully land grant, that we can actually build the workforce so that those itinerant services can be delivered to children where they are, the continuity of care, and that children aren't having to move and parents having to juggle to get the needs of their children met. So we work very closely with the 619, the preschool special ed 619 coordinator within our context, the public education, people who work with the public education school programs, they're in our department now. They'll be part of our department. So superintendents and charter leaders have to work with 2 departments. And they don't want to, but they have to. But that's kind of the reality because and we have to work in close partnership with public education. So because these programs are in elementary schools, and so we want to be aligned there too. We don't want to misalign. But the reality is we have a lot of expertise in this department around child development and what educators need and the support. And we want to be that resource to public education, to public schools across the state.
Great, thank you. So we probably have time for 1 or 2 more questions, and I see one in the chat. The question from Weibing Chen of the PDG B-5 TA Center: can the presenter speak more to the idea of gaining buy-in from the stakeholders in the legislature, especially on the funding question? What are some strategies for folks who may be in more fiscally conservative small government states? And then Secretary Graginski mentioned support from diverse sectors like business and philanthropy. Secretary, maybe I'll turn it to you to start and then go to Lachelle.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so in this state for another, at least a decade, there have been legislators trying to tap our land grant permanent fund. And some of you may not have land grants in your states, but we have large parts of our land that are tribal lands and that are federal lands, so that we can't really get resources either through taxation. And so I'm probably oversimplifying it. Anyway, we have a land grant permanent fund that has grown now to almost $22 billion, and it mostly supports education. A portion of it each year goes to a set of beneficiaries. And so they've been working very diligently, and many of the conservatives are absolutely opposed. But what the conservatives that were opposed to that were the ones who proposed the Early Childhood Trust Fund. So that may be a way where it was like, okay, we have some reserves, we have some extra money this year, let's put it into a trust fund that the State Investment Council can continue to invest and grow. So that may be one way to think about for a conservative state, putting a trust fund towards your children's future that can grow over time, and you can think about it distributing. Ours is based on oil and gas and federal mineral leasing. So all of you have seen what's at the pump right now and going across. So you can see our trust fund at $300 million is anticipated to grow to $1.6 billion by next year. So it'll put out 5% of the corpus of that fund, or 30 million, whichever is greater. So those might be some strategies. The land grant is a more thing that people who are risk averse are not excited about, but we're going to ask the voters what they think. We got it through the legislature because there was a change in legislative leadership, and some of the more conservative members were replaced by more progressive members. And so that happened. Those are some things that I can say, but definitely thinking about the financing, because you don't want to set people up to think that just a governance structure is going to change outcomes. Just want to be clear about that.
Thanks, Secretary. I see that we've got one more question in the chat. So Lachelle, I'll ask you to respond, but I do, and I'm sorry to crimp into your time even further, but did want to say that it is worth noting that there have been some conservative states, and I know mostly Alabama as an example here, that have made some governance changes. And I think that, Alabama is a state that has showed a lot of leadership in early childhood and felt like it was critical to maintain the quality of their program to have a standalone agency and the kind of leadership that other states have had. So, again,
can I add to that, Elliot? Because I think what you're
Please, yeah.
saying is right in the sense that there's more transparency when you have it all
Yeah.
together, so that a legislature might feel more confident of putting dollars into something where they can see it and they can see how the dollars are being spent, and they may feel more comfortable than increasing those investments, because they get in the weeds. In our legislatures, they only see things really rolled up at a very high level. And so if your programs and services are buried in all these different agencies, they may not be able to understand how those investments are being used. And so I would agree that I think having that department helps them see where the dollars are going and how they're being spent and what the outcomes are as a result.
Lachelle, you touched on it briefly, and I know the work is ongoing, but anything to say about the legislature in Wyoming?
I would just say that was the hope for us through this process, is that getting it into one location would, help give that level of leadership communication about the importance of this, the data that would support that, because I think in Wyoming, we don't provide state dollars other than what the matches are required and the MOE requirements for the federal funding. So that is part of our challenge. And I do think that is our hope through this effort of moving these programs closer together, where there's, leadership and communication and data available, that it will help get that buy-in and support for additional funding.
So we've got one more question in the chat, and I'm going to sort of step in front of this one, although if either of our any of our other panelists want to jump in afterwards, because data systems are near and dear to my heart. So if you haven't seen in the chat, Nebraska's Ben Baumfalk asked about efforts to integrate data and then discussions about governance and finance, and the worry that they'll get too far down the road building something that may be irrelevant if governance changes are coming. And the question of, does the governance work need to come before integrating data, or can they happen concurrently? As a follow-up, how can the data work catalyze and inform discussions around governance? So this is tricky, right? And it's a great question because the two are definitely interrelated, but they are not the same. And for those of you who have done work on data, you probably know that the human systems surrounding data management are in many ways way harder than the technology of data integration. So I guess what I would say is this: I would never, just as a matter of personal philosophy, I will never recommend to anyone, oh no, like wait on your data project. But be thinking about that, right? Like, and think about the relationship of the two. And the reality is, though, in any data infrastructure that you're building, it's never going to be solely the province of one agency, right? Even if you create an early childhood agency, whatever data it has is going to need to connect to the health and human services agencies, the education agencies. So one way or another, you're going to need a framework that allows data to be integrated among multiple agencies. And thinking about how are we creating a framework for data management that allows for that, and a technology that's adaptable to that in a relatively rapid fashion. To me, like, those principles should guide the conversation. And while the timing of how these things are going will sometimes be messy in different places, like, as long as you have those principles in mind, chances are it's going to come out okay. Ben, I hope that answers the question. And Secretary and Lachelle, I just would briefly pause if you have anything you want to add in our last 90 seconds. I see a thumbs up from Ben.
Oh, good. Ben got his question answered. That's what's important. I think, yeah, I would agree. You have to tackle the data stuff, and it's taking that human-centered design approach is going to be a good way. And then I'm involved with the HHS 2020 because I'm also part of the Health Huddle secretaries. And I'm involved in the New Mexico longitudinal data system with my education and my workforce solution cabinet secretary. So we're all having these conversations separate from governance, but also connected. So I think keep up the good work. And I think using administrative data where you can to create some linkages to better understand how our current policies and practices are actually resulting in outcomes for children is a great body of work to be doing outside of whether we're doing governance. But use that administrative data, find ways to do it with researchers, private sector partners to link those data sets. We can learn a lot, I think. It can inform your governance.
I will turn it back to, oh, sorry, someone else was.
I was just going to say that doing that can actually inform your governance, possibly. So.
Yes. We are out of time. I'm sorry to run up right to the edge, but I will turn it back to Deb Anderson.
There, too many buttons to push. Thank you. That was an excellent presentation. Great grounding with the information, and then love the examples from the states. I just can't say enough about this entire week and this strand of how informative it's been. We've heard from, 4 national presentations and 5 states mixed in the past 4 days. And the one thing that we know about governance in states is that it's different in every state. But I loved, Elliot, your comment that, it's probably different for a reason, But if it still looks the way that it does in 20 years, then we probably aren't doing things right either. So it definitely is an evolving process. We're learning from each other, and we hope that this gave you all the opportunity for that. I put a couple of resources to remind you. They've been the same resources you've seen in other sessions to the PDG B-5 website and Research Connections. And with that, I want to say thank you to all of you for coming today. Hope you enjoyed the conference so far. We have one more closing session that you won't want to miss. That'll start in about 29 minutes. So have a great rest of the conference, and we hope to see you all soon. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.